Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our Marine Money webinar series. My name is John Chair, and today I have the great pleasure of having Position Green on our webinar series with me. For those that don't know Position Green, they are a company that have been around since around 2015 and have helped clients transition their ESG practices from simple compliance actions to celebrated and quantifiable sustainable impacts. They achieve this through a combination of consulting services and cutting-edge software that drives sustainability, success, and empowers positive change. On top of that, they've had a wealth of e-learning resources that allows anyone in your organization to get up to speed on the concepts that surround this important topic. Leading the conversation today, we have Erin Knowles and Tariq Desai. Erin works as a manager for Position Green USA, working closely with clients with their sustainability strategies and reporting, greenhouse gas inventories, and developing climate risk scenario analysis. And Tariq leads Position Green's human rights work, working with clients and conducting all stages of human rights due diligence across their supply chain. With regards to this webinar, please feel free to utilize the Q&A panel to ask your questions at the bottom of your screen. And at the end of the webinar, with time permitting, I'll ask those questions to the team. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Erin, who's going to take you through this session. Thanks, Erin.
Yes, thank you, Jonathan. And I'll pull up my screen to share now. Where did I go? All right, thanks everyone for joining us today. So you're here for navigating the new area of shipping, sustainable shipping, and how shipping companies can prepare for upcoming regulation in Europe and the US. As mentioned, I'm Erin Knowles, manager in USA, and then Tariq is joining us from our Oslo office. So what we'll be covering today, we're going to start with some global context as relates to the IMO. Then we'll go into European Union, then what's going on in the US. We'll also share a little bit of insights from our recent ESG 100 report that we released, and then we'll cover human and labor rights. So diving right into the global context, as I'm sure you're all aware, the IMO released an updated GHG strategy in July of 2023. So there were many challenges with the previous strategy, and there's a lot of critiques that said it wasn't as ambitious as it needed to be and didn't really align with the Paris Agreement. So what they've done recently is update it so that it's a bit more aligned with Paris and a little bit more of an aggressive timeline. I think one of the main components to take away from it as well is the idea of well to wake. So this is a focus on life cycle emissions of fuels. So looking at the full kind of end to end of a fuel to understand its life cycle emissions so that there aren't displacement of emissions along the value chain. So looking at the way it's manufactured and the impacts that go into its creation, as well as what happens when it's actually used in an engine. So on the right side, you'll see a graph kind of looking at the targets over year. And I've kind of broken that down into something a little more understandable, just kind of very high level look at what's now expected. So they've kind of broken it down between a minimum target and then a strive for. So what we see here is between now and 2030, we're looking to get a 20% minimum reduction as compared to 2008 baseline levels, with striving for a 30% reduction. By 2040, we're looking at a 70% reduction minimum with a strive for percentage of 80% reductions. And then that would get the shipping industry on track to reach net zero by 2050. Obviously, there's a lot of questions around how this will be achieved and what fuels will be used. So the IMO holds a position that there's still a lot of operational efficiencies that can be achieved through right timing delivery that would reduce idling time, and of course, adopting fuels, which some of the kind of top leaders in that right now are ammonia and methanol. Looking to the European Union, I've kind of done a breakdown of, how to kind of understand where these regulations are coming from, kind of the high level EU Green Deal they created the EU Green Deal, which then kind of feeds into the Fit for 55. And in order to obtain the goals in Fit for 55, there's been development of financial mechanisms such as the EU Emissions Trading Scheme, or EU ETS, and disclosure requirements, which CSRD, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, is something that shipping companies need to be aware of. Now we can spend an entire, I think, session looking at each of these in detail, but I'm going to focus on the EU ETS and the CSRD because I think it's the most important for shipping companies to be aware of right now. So this is the EU ETS kind of scope of vessels that'll be affected. And so what the EU ETS does is essentially sets an absolute limit on the total amount of greenhouse gas emissions that can be emitted each year by entities covered by the system. The idea is to reduce emissions over time, and entities can buy or receive emissions allowances within the limit. So as you can see, this is affecting pretty much all of commercial shipping, passengers, cargo, and offshore for any vessels that are over 5,000 gigatons. As we kind of move further along, it's going to include less than 5,000 gigatons, but that is looking more at 2026. And this is important to see because I know there's a lot of, being the global nature of shipping, there's a lot of, kind of variances in where you're porting, what flags you fly. So this is kind of a simple breakdown of how the EU ETS is expected to affect shipping companies, whether or not they're EU domiciled or not. So looking, you can see here that there's for EU ports, if you're traveling to or from one, but going to another port in a different region, it'll be applicable to 50% of the emissions. If you're traveling between EU ports, that'll be applicable to 100% of emissions. And then if you're at berth, that will also be 100% of emissions. Now, this kind of breakdown of percentages is, it's kind of a fraction at this time, because it's not going to be immediately 100% of emissions that are going to be subjected to this. So there's a little bit of time to this implementation. So in 2024, we're looking at a 40% emissions being kind of subjected to this rate. In 2025, it'll be 70% of total emissions, and then 2026 will be 100%. And the emissions, the greenhouse gas emissions that they're looking at for this is carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide as well. Now moving into the CSRD, I'm sure this has gotten a lot of conversations internally for your teams, and so just wanted to take a quick look at kind of what this means. It applies to over 50,000 companies and requires that companies adapt their reports to comply with the European Sustainability Reporting Standards. The ESRS is made up of 82 disclosures, which are assessed through a double materiality assessment to determine which of the disclosure topics are relevant to the business. And I'll get into a little bit deeper into the disclosure requirements and double materiality assessment. So this is a high-level look at the disclosure requirements. So as you can see, it kind of breaks down from general disclosure requirements to environmental, social, and governance. So there's a total of 82, which is quite a large number when you look at it. But essentially, what the process is that you go through each of these disclosure requirements, you assess from a double materiality perspective whether or not it's of material topic to your company, and then from there you're able to kind of determine what needs to be reported on. So if you're unfamiliar with a double materiality assessment at this point, what it means is essentially looking at materiality from both an impact materiality lens as well as financial materiality. So you're looking at the impact that your business has on the planet and people, then also the financial materiality of transition and climate physical risks. So kind of going through this assessment, it helps to narrow down the list so you're not reporting on all the several requirements that the ESRS does require. So, this process is, helpful in understanding the strategy and how shipping companies should navigate the upcoming CSRD requirements. And, we've been helping companies kind of get through this process and developed a software tool as well that can help navigate this in a way that's, easy to track and, ready for assurance as well. So this is a look at the CSRD implementation timeline. So if you're unfamiliar, going into next year, this is when the legacy businesses that were already subject to the non-financial reporting directive will have to comply with the CSRD. So it'll incorporate the results from the fiscal year of 2024 for the report to be published in 2025. Looking into 2025, that's when you're bringing in large undertakings. So they have to be EU domiciled companies that satisfy at least two of the following, which is net revenue over 40 million euros. Quick translation to USD would be 42.4 million. Assets over 20 million euros, or employees over 250. So two of each of those will kind of put you into subjection to the CSRD. The following year in 2026, that'll be EU domiciled companies that do not satisfy the previous requirements, but are still listed on an EU exchange. And then once you get to 2028, that's where we'll look at material non-EU companies. So non-EU domiciled entities with at least once a subsidiary or branch in the EU with revenues over 150 million euro or 159 million USD. So it's really important to kind of understand this as a shipping business and kind of the global nature, because no matter if you're EU domiciled or not, there's still going to be kind of questions that come down the pipe from your suppliers, from ports and every kind of area of your business. So it's good to be aware of kind of what's being asked along the value chain in shipping. Which brings us to the United States. Of course, the United States has taken a little bit more time in releasing, what's going to be required. I hope no one has held their breath for the SEC disclosure requirements. We're, of course, still waiting on that direction. And I think with the recent passing of California's greenhouse gas disclosure requirements, we're going to get a taste for how things are going to play out with the legalities around those kinds of regulations. There is still some movement and direction, however, so I don't think, I don't think there's any reason to kind of not start taking action. The Paris Agreement, when we kind of re-entered that, set the goal to achieve 50% net reduction in emissions by 2030. The White House issued a long-term strategy to achieve net zero emissions by 2050 with a roadmap for maritime. And the roadmap outlines actions on research, domestic and international stakeholder engagement, infrastructure investment, and design and planning. Additionally, the Inflation Reduction Act created an increased appetite for renewables and offshore wind, and includes funding funding for port retrofit. So there's a lot of kind of funding going to that as well, if that's kind of your interest area here. And I would say, given that there's an upcoming election year and the friction in Congress right now, it is unlikely that there was going to be a passing of the requirements in the very near future. But, despite delays, what we're telling people and kind of what our position here at Position Green is that due to the global nature of shipping, it's important to stay on top of these global trends. There are areas of significant business that are, going to be changing across the value chain, as mentioned, as relates to Europe. And I think it will become to be very prominent in as you kind of engage with your suppliers and customers. Additionally, there's not going to be, any huge surprises, I think, with what the U.S. decides to do. They did state that they're going to follow existing frameworks like TCFD and the GHG protocol. So, I think the best thing to do right now is actually to start, making sure that you are you're disclosing with these requirements, and then I think you'll be all set and not hit by any big surprises or feel like you have a large undertaking in a short amount of time in the near future. With that said, I wanted to share the interoperability of the framework. So there's been a lot of work done internally, and I have to take my hat off to these these different frameworks because they've really spent a lot of time having conversations and just making sure that we're not duplicating efforts, we're not making too much work for ourselves in terms of all these different frameworks and standards. So this is kind of a quick look at how CSRD kind of relates and has interoperability with things like SFDR, TCFD, so Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, ISSB, which kind of recently absorbed SASB, GRI, Global Reporting Initiatives, and then TNFD, which is a new framework that came out related to nature disclosures. So, kind of the position that we have here is that if you're kind of complying with some of these other ones like GRI, ISSB, then, as things come up with the CSRD, even if you're not EU domiciled, you'll be pretty well prepared to answer those questions. And this is just a quick look at some news items that came through around, the interoperability. There's been a lot of work done, as mentioned, to make sure that the frameworks kind of align with each other. So, really trying to streamline these efforts while, still capturing the important data and making it comparable. And this is a look at a recommendation of a timeline that we have as you're kind of navigating the sustainability and ESG space. There's obviously a lot of work to be done, but there's a way to kind of time it out so you're not fitting it all into one quarter or feeling rushed. So this is kind of our recommendation for how to approach it. So, around August through October, can do a double materiality assessment, kind of get yourself set up going into the next year. During that time as well, it's a good time to do a risk and opportunity scenario analysis through TCFD and TNFD. The TCFD scenario analysis is really great for understanding your climate risk, both from a transition, market perspective, regulation perspective, and then physical perspective as well. And then you can also look at things like how the EU ETS may affect your company as related to your emissions and trajectory for reductions. Between November and December, good time for a gap analysis. So once you have the information, understanding how to address it within the company, understand, where there's gaps. And then going into December and January, if science-based targets kind of on your list. I know it's a little complicated for the shipping industry, but we do make that recommendation to some clients if that's where they're at in their journey. Going into the new year, great time to do your greenhouse gas accounting first quarter, get all the data together, then you can incorporate it into your sustainability report. And then once you've done all that work, it's a great time to look into your CDP reporting. So another kind of great thing of the interoperability between these frameworks is CDP has kind of made part of their questionnaire fit well with the TCFD scenario analysis outcomes. So if you've done a TCFD and then you're submitting to CDP, you're in really good shape for your transparency and disclosures. And then looking at kind of bringing this all together, the Position Green actually each year releases an annual report of 100 largest listed companies. So we're Scandinavian founded. So right now we're just focusing on Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. So this is a 6-year we published a report. And this is the first year that we've actually assessed the ESRS readiness, which has been very helpful to kind of see comparing companies against their ESRS readiness. So in total, 300 companies were assessed, including in shipping and energy. So this is some key findings from shipping. I think shipping has benefited from being, very much used to reporting. So, the shipping industry actually did really well in disclosing some information that other industries, it's a little newer for them. It was interesting to see that 61% of shipping companies that were assessed actually had set up a link between executive pay and ESG targets. So that was the #1 industry that was found to be doing this. As well as 66% of shipping companies that were assessed were prepared or close to being prepared for the ESRS disclosure requirements. That was the #2 industry to be in that position. But remember, these are Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. So they've had a little more time to get used to this. So I think if you're kind of if you're not in that position or you're kind of not ready, good time to really look at how prepared you are. Another interesting point was that 11% shipping was the least likely to report a CEO pay ratio. So this is kind of getting into the governance side of reporting, and then kind of related to DEI and human and labor rights. Shipping was the worst performing industry on reporting on discrimination, harassment, incidents, or gender pay gap. But despite this, they saw the strongest approach to reporting about human rights. So kind of a little discrepancy there, but interesting thing to see within the shipping industry. And some final key findings from shipping. The industry had the highest disclosure rates for Scope 1 emissions, nature and biodiversity commitments, and then greenhouse gas reduction initiatives. And kind of what set companies apart, whether they got a high rating on this ESG 100 or low, was whether or not they reported on Scope 2 and 3 emissions. And finally, some things to consider for the shipping industry would be financial effects from material and physical risks and opportunities, investments to support transition plans, collection of EU taxonomy data, setting an internal carbon price, and then looking at the financial effects from nature-related risks and opportunities. And with that, I will hand it off to my colleague, Tariq, who will go into the human and labor rights side of the equation.
Hello. So I'll be talking to you about human and labor rights. The idea is to get you up to date on kind of the regulatory push that's happening in this space. But to begin with, even though you're clearly all great at human rights reporting, I thought I'd just give you a bit of a background as to what human rights are. And they're essentially a minimum standard by which people should be treated. This is primarily a responsibility of businesses, but through recent developments, it's been more understood that, responsibility of countries, but it's been more understood that businesses also have a responsibility as they impact people in many different ways. This is kind of examples of different human rights that we have, but they are not restricted to this. And if we go to the next slide, these are the kind of sources where we get our human rights from. They're international treaties. The top three are really the main ones that people talk about, the International Bill of Rights being formed of the Universal Declaration, which everyone knows, and a couple of international treaties. And I've also added some ones specifically related to the marine and shipping industry, just to show that this has also been thought through for this industry as well, not just at a general level. And if we go to the next slide, I just wanted to give a few examples of how shipping companies can impact human rights. A really big issue is, especially with shipbreaking, but also building and repair. In some countries where ships are broken down, there's poor health and safety standards. You can have child labor, you can be exposed to safety hazards, toxic waste. There can be excessive overtime, poor pay, and it's an impact that is connected to shipping. It's not connected to the way the ship is operated, but it is something that ship owners, ship managers have some sort of leverage over and can influence. If we go to the next slide. Another issue is with ports and terminals. Ships go all across the world, and lots of different ports, lots of different terminals have different standards of working conditions and how they treat the people who live there, live and work there. So in terms of acquisitions for ports, this may mean that people are forcibly removed from their land. And even though ships and ship managers, they don't have a direct influence over this, this is something that they are connected to and something that they should really be thinking about in terms of how they plan their routes and how they engage with ports. And on the next stage, I have another final example, which is more close to home. It's about seafarers. And there have been reports of excessive working hours, bullying and harassment, poor health and safety, and also exposure to piracy risk. If you're putting your seafarers in danger, that can be considered a human rights issue. Recruitment fees and modern slavery is something that, particularly with shipping, but in a lot of industries, is an issue. If your seafarers have to pay recruitment fees, there is a risk that they are in debt bondage, which can lead to modern slavery. And this isn't just something that happens to a minority. If you go to the next next slide, you can see that 40% of seafarers have actually experienced some sort of unethical action. And 70% of those have been asked to pay fees by manning agents. And this is a recent report from 2023, and it's 5,000 seafarers have responded to this. So this is an issue that ship managers especially can have a big influence over and can improve. And the reason I brought this up is just to show that human rights is something that is very important, but also connected to shipping, as with many and most industries globally. So if we go to the next slide, the question is, how do you actually manage those risks? And the answer was given to us in the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. As the title indicates, it is a voluntary set of standards which helps companies to figure out where to prioritize their actions and how to manage it. And it's all based around this concept called human rights due diligence, which is more of a risk management framework, which is focused on risk to people rather than risk to business. So the idea is that if you implement all the stages of human rights due diligence correctly, you will have as much information as possible and the right information to actually manage your negative human rights impacts and hopefully reduce those impacts. And core to this is really having the right culture in place, so having the right policy commitments, the right management systems, and stakeholder dialogue, which is something which is a bit different to how a lot of companies try and do their risk management. But by talking to impacted people, you can actually do a lot of this. You can identify the right adverse impacts, you can assess how serious they are, you can work through the right actions and create the right action plans to reduce those impacts. And also you can find out whether those action plans are working. So stakeholder dialogue is something that's really key. This doesn't mean, well, often it doesn't mean investors as stakeholders, it means the impacted people. Figuring out how to identify who those impacted people are is the work, and that is difficult. And what is important with this framework is that perfection isn't expected. It is understood that different companies have different resources available, they have different contexts, and getting to the bottom of everything is going to be difficult. What is expected is that it's ongoing, that companies try and act in good faith, and they try with each iteration to go more and more in depth. And this is particularly important because the responsibility of business, according to the guiding principles, goes all the way through the supply chain. So it's not just with your immediate contracting business partners and suppliers, but their suppliers, their sub-suppliers, all the way down to wherever the products or services come from or originate from. So yeah, this is how you do it. And now what's happening is nations are getting a bit, I guess, impatient is a word that is applicable here, because they are actually introducing mandatory human rights due diligence laws. This map shows the state of play in Europe. There's a few countries that have, if not full human rights due diligence laws, at least something to do with, for instance, modern slavery. And there's other countries that are considering these either through a draft law or civil society calling for it. So if we go to the next slide, I don't know why I keep saying stage. We can also see that the USA has a law which is starting to introduce a bit more human rights due diligence into national legislation, and that's the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. And what's important here is that goods linked to forced labor from the Uyghur region are prohibited from entering the country, and this has a requirement that companies must prove that there is no link to forced labor. So by implementing human rights due diligence correctly, companies can have access to that information. As you can see, Norway, where I'm based, has a law, and yeah, even Canada has just introduced a Modern Slavery Act. So this is something that is coming, it's spreading, and it's something that companies are going to have to get to grips with wherever they are. If we go to the next slide, we can also see that the European Union is taking human rights due diligence more seriously. It's mentioned in the ESRS, which Erin was talking about earlier. One way to gather the data, especially for the S topics here, and to make sure that you have the right processes in place, is to implement human rights due diligence. Also, there's the EU taxonomy, which is a categorization system for showing which companies are meeting climate objectives. But in order to meet those climate objectives, you also have to meet certain minimum requirements, minimum safeguards, and one of those minimum safeguards is to do human rights due diligence. And there's also the upcoming CSRD, or Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, which also requires companies to do not only human rights due diligence, but environmental due diligence. So there's a lot of regulation coming that is all based around that human rights due diligence framework. So in terms of interoperability, if you get that framework sorted, you will be able to comply with most of the regulations that come along. They may have different reporting requirements, but the foundation will be the same. If we go to the next slide. The question then is, what is adequate human rights due diligence? As I said, different companies have different contexts, and adequacy is a way to think this through. No one's going to expect you to do everything, but you need to be able to justify what you do. It's kind of like showing your workings. If you say this supply chain is too difficult to understand, why is it too difficult to understand? Is it because your suppliers prize confidentiality? Are they about sorry, I was just reading the wrap up. We're a couple of slides away, so don't worry about that. But yeah, if you basically have to act in good faith, make sure that you are doing what you can and justifying that. And if you feel you can justify it, that should be enough for adequacy. We'll go to the next slide. It's the summary, which is why you should do it. It's not just about increased regulation, but you improve your risk management, you have greater access to business opportunity, you get positive recognition, and you don't have that risk of poor reputation if something happens. You improve your relationships with your stakeholders, with your ship managers, or with your crew, which is really important for productivity. And you actually make yourself more attractive to talented people, which is, of course, what makes businesses successful. And yeah, that's everything I had to say. I also just want to say that next week we have a demo at 10 a.m. Eastern time, which will be led by our account manager, Sarah Kneadler, and there's a link in the chat. Thank you.
Thank you, Tariq. And I think that, calling out and kind of ending on the seafarers is really important, because I know that in talking to management and executive teams, that is a factor that is always at the forefront of their mind. And especially having come out of COVID and then kind of going into this next foray of geopolitical tension, they're always thinking about their seafarers and how to best accommodate them. So I think that's a really great thing to call out. I want to get to a couple of questions that came in. And I think that if we go back to, I think, Erin, one of the slides that came in that you were talking about, there's a lot of discussion around, like, there are a lot of frameworks out there, right? And a lot of these frameworks have an acronym that makes it really hard to kind of remember exactly which one you're kind of playing with. If you go back to that table of different frameworks that yes, perfect. So there was a question around so which is the best framework to use? Do you have to use all of them? And the reason the question around do you have to use all of them is that you showed a timeline, I think, next, where you start off with some of these frameworks and then you also ended those frameworks. So maybe could you just clarify how those frameworks all fit together and that?
Yeah, definitely. So I think, it depends on which perspective you're kind of coming from, if you're in the US or if you're in Europe. And these, some of these relate to annual reports, and some of these relate more to, information that supplies your annual report or supplies something like a CDP questionnaire response. So, I would say for an annual report, to kind of have all your bases covered for questions that might come from your, European counterparts, would be to do an annual report that includes ISSB or SASB. So that's the International Sustainability Standards Board, which now kind of regulates the SASB reporting structure. And they have very industry frameworks. They have one for maritime that we use with a lot of our clients. And that kind of has a great, look into the impacts that a business, that kind of financial and climate risk has on a business. And then the GRI does a really great job of doing kind of the outside, the inside out perspective. So looking at the impact that a company has on, on their stakeholders, on the environment. And so those kind of interplay really well together to kind of then fit into the ESRS kind of larger disclosures. Related to TCFD and TNFD, those are more kind of information that kind of fill into those annual reports. So task force or climate related financial disclosures, that's where the kind of climate risk assessment comes in, and really kind of just helps your company, helps your stakeholders understand the risks that are involved related to both the physical climate and then also the transition risks that are coming into play. We use research from the International Energy Agency. We use the IPCC to kind of understand what's forecasted to come based on different potential circumstances that are going to take place. And then the TNFD was a more recent framework that came out, and that's more related to the nature disclosures. So, biodiversity, ensuring that, there's kind of no like risks or impacts there, or minimized at least. And then when you kind of look at the timeline, that's kind of why this all plays into each other. So, the TCFD, as mentioned, kind of like fills into the annual report. These are more actions for accounting here with the greenhouse gas protocol. This is more reduction strategy. This is the disclosures, in the voluntary market, like in the US. And then the CDP is it's a resource for stakeholders such as investors and kind of analysts to understand the impacts of a company through the CDP. And the reason why it kind of comes full circle with the CSRD kind of year to year is because, when you are exposed to that, you do have to kind of report on that annually as well. And, what we're seeing more and more too is there's more financial sustainability reporting is coming more on par with financial reporting.
Right. One of the questions that we came about it, and you started to talk about it, was like at the beginning was so do we only report on the double material items, or would we also report on the individual material items? And I think that was more that, that matrix that I think was when that question came in.
So essentially, once you go through kind of the double materiality assessment, you do have to assess each of the disclosures and essentially make a statement around, if it impacts the business and if it's related to a material topic of the business, and if so, like, why and what are you doing about it? And then, for the ones that are not material, you have to, explain why they're not material. So you do have to kind of come up with a response to each, but, then once you figure out the ones that you need to focus on, then you're able to, come up with the mitigation strategies for them, but you don't have to come up with like the strategies for ones that are not material. You just have to kind of explain why you've decided those are not relevant.
Okay. All right, great. All right, and then I think there were a couple of questions around the EU ETS. Now, maybe kind of a quick description of what it is exactly in your guys' mind. I know that a lot of people are aware of it, but just as to kind of lay the groundwork. And then there was a question about how is it being priced, how are allowances being like determined?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So the idea here is emissions trading scheme. It's essentially to put a cap on what kind of carbon is being emitted through business with the EU. So essentially the I guess the dollar amount is being kind of assessed. It's almost similar to the way the dollar, euro or the US dollar kind of can fluctuate. So there's actually a carbon price that's been kind of assessed and kind of fluctuates over time. And you can do like a quick Google search, the EU ETS price of carbon. I think there's a great resource online called Carbon Markets that kind of shows that. So you can kind of understand over time, what's the average, maybe even just to get a sense for what the average rate is. I think the most recent price that was given out was September 20th. It was at 82 euro per ton of carbon emitted. So that's just kind of a good number to kind of think of. And if you have your emissions laid out, you can kind of, then obviously multiply that by tons emitted and kind of get a sense for what you might be exposed to. And then, looking through the kind of allowance and emissions, if you're kind of going between ports, you're between ports in Europe, you're exposed to 100% of those emissions. Although, again, that's kind of going to be implemented over time. So it's 100% of the emissions, but it's kind of 40% of that total 100%, if that makes sense. So it's a little bit phased and tiered at this moment. And then in 2026, the 100%, it'll be kind of related back to like 50% of the 100% total.
Got it.
Hope that clarifies it a little bit.
Yeah. I guess with regards to strategies that ship owners and ship managers are starting to utilize to kind of game the EU ETS system, or to be compliant, it's maybe a better way of describing that. So are you seeing any interesting strategies around the buying and selling of these carbon, like, I guess the carbon credits or the allowances yet? Or is that something that is still kind of playing out? I mean, is it worth like buying now and then just holding them? How long can you hold them for? That kind of thing.
Yeah, I think it's still all pretty new, because it's kind of just been put into place and, kind of starting to be active in 2024. So I think that's, the strategies are kind of still being developed. And I think too, for understanding this a little bit better, my colleagues in Europe are a little more exposed to the EU ETS, so I can ask them and see if they have, if they've seen anything on the European side of how people are approaching it, and come back with, some insight into that on the demo next week too.
Yeah, no, that'd be great, because I do remember I was talking to a ship owner and they were talking about how they're actually starting to rethink about the sorts of vessels, the type in their fleet that they're now deploying to the EU, just to be more like efficient with regards to their carbon emissions. And so it might mean redeploying some of their fleet from what they like historically done to try to reduce that amount.
Yeah. Definitely like using more like dual fuel ships and kind of those jurisdictions compared to the traditional fuels. Yeah, I think that's something that's being assessed for sure.
Perfect. We had a couple of questions about whether or not these slides will be available to people that joined. I'm sure, yes, we will be sending you a video.
Yeah, I'll just double check with my team, with our legal, and make sure that we can send, but I think we should be able to.
Okay, perfect. All right, so then on that, I'd like to say thank you guys for, actually, we got one more question that came in. What causes for payment of credit are being developed? What clauses for payment of credits are being developed? I guess with regards to when you purchase these carbon allowances, are there any what are the terms, I guess, for purchasing them? Are you familiar with that or not?
I don't have the full details on kind of those financial terms, but again, I can see if my team has kind of dealt with that over in Europe just yet. Again, I think the structure is all pretty new, so it's kind of understanding, what that will all look like. So again, can get more on that next week.
Yeah, great. So yeah, for the audience, we are having an in-depth workshop next week where it's going to be like a more of like a Zoom meeting where we'll take Sarah will take you guys through the platform and through their service, and we'll be able to answer like more specific questions that you might have about your organization. So don't forget to register for that. I put a link in the chat, so if anybody wants to just click on that, you more than feel free to register. But in the meantime, thank you, Erin and Tariq, for taking us through that. That was really great. Hopefully the audience has walked away with a little bit more enlightened in the ESG realm. And thank you, audience, for tuning in. And we'll be back in touch with regards to the follow-up session and the video and slides that we can share pending legal's permission. All right. Well, thank you, everyone, so much for joining, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.
Thank you.